We are our own worst enemies in this country, and we're doing a lot of harm to ourselves and our country with our idiocy, aren't we? I'm going to show you again how logic and reason is surrendered to hysteria, emotionalism and ideology in two big policy areas, in two of our most important real-world challenges: climate change and pandemic management. I'll start with climate change. The flooding is continuing around Sydney's northwestern fringes and up into the Hunter Valley and Central Coast. It's terrible, it is a natural disaster, and nobody should downplay the impact. But neither should we pretend it is unprecedented, or pretend this shows the world is getting more dangerous, or pretend that this is all about climate change visiting Armageddon upon us. Now, there are three critical reasons for not being hysterical like this, and it's got nothing to do with denying the science of climate change. In fact, it's all about being factual and science-based. The first reason is don't talk like this to heighten the fear in our community, especially for children. Don't unnecessarily alarm young people. It scares them. It changes their mindset. It makes them despondent about our future unnecessarily. Secondly, don't do this because it downplays the heroics of our forebears. Everyone who's inhabited this continent before us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, has battled floods, storms, droughts and bushfires. Don't pretend we've got it tougher than them when we certainly have not. Thirdly, and most importantly, don't let this climate-driven rhetoric distract us from doing the practical things that will protect us in the future. We need to have clearings around housing to protect them from bushfire. We need to manage fuel loads. We need dams. We need dams to both store water and to mitigate floods. But instead of doing this stuff in recent decades, when dam after dam project has been scuttled and we've built desalination plants because we believe Tim Flannery and his ilk promoting permanent drought, well, instead of doing this practical stuff, we've pretended we can change the climate. Listen to our own Prime Minister when assessing the flood damage today.
What we know is that Australia has always been subject of floods, of bushfires, but we know that the science told us that if we continued to not take action globally on climate change, then these events, extreme weather events, would be more often and more intense. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that play out.
There you go. The scientist Albanese. It's all about climate change. So instead of committing to raising the dam wall at Warragamba, for instance, he blames all this on climate. And he offers the fanciful notion that climate change policies in Australia and elsewhere, policies in Australia that affect just 1.2% of global emissions, that somehow these policies can produce a kind of thermostatically controlled nirvana where natural disasters are a thing of the past. So that when visiting the flood zone today, Anthony Albanese actually said this too.
We are looking at long-term solutions. My government has changed Australia's position on climate change from day one.
Wow, that's a long-term solution on floods. This is quite literally ludicrous. There is no way Albanese, styling himself as some sort of King Canute, can hold back floodwaters by fiddling with his climate policies. The only impact climate policies have had on flood-hit communities is make their electricity more expensive and less reliable. Yet most of the media and half of our politicians go along with this charade. And the one thing they could have done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago is raise the Warragamba Dam wall. Yet even today, at a federal, Labor and state Liberal level, they talk and they obfuscate instead of getting on with it.
We haven't yet had the business case finalised, assessed, there are environmental approvals. All those things will be considered at the appropriate time. We'll work cooperatively.
What I do know in relation to this issue of the dam is that discussions are underway between the state and Commonwealth governments in relation to raising the Warragamba Dam wall. That's something the New South Wales government has worked on for some time. And obviously it's a complex project and it is one that requires a lot of planning approvals and environmental approvals at both a state and federal level.
Discussions, planning approvals, it's been 30 years just to build the damn wall. Make a sensible decision. Frustrated locals today took the demand for practical action directly to the Premier and Prime Minister.
What do we need to do? You're releasing the dam 97.9% when the catchment areas are full, and the cry comes from the government. It's not a flood mitigation dam.
Yeah, damn straight. Tackle the things you can change, not the ones you can't. And in case you doubt my interpretation of the science and my assessment of an ideological media that's allergic to the facts, have a listen to this ABC radio interview with one of Australia's foremost climate change experts last night.
Andy Pittman, how unusual is what we're seeing now in New South Wales?
Well, actually not very unusual at all. We get events of this sort of size every year, sometimes a couple a year on average. What we've seen over the weekend is basically an East Coast low. The unusual thing is the East Coast low formed and produced a lot of rainfall over already saturated catchments. The catchments had no capacity to store that water, and so it flowed down the rivers and caused the flooding that we've seen on TV. So it's not actually particularly unusual. It's a fairly characteristic weather event.
OK, so the ABC reporter wants the floods to be more unusual than they are, and listen to how much he wants this to be all about global warming.
It is unusual, though, for people to be flooded 3 times in the space of a year. So what is at play here?
So that's not entirely clear. There are people who will say that this is evidence of climate change, but there isn't a great deal of evidence for that. But that doesn't mean there's no climate change signal in these events. It's just that the scientists can't show that there's a climate change signal.
Right, so it could actually be climate change. We just can't say it with certainty. Is that right?
Well, there actually isn't any evidence of its climate change. It's not a question of certainty. These weather events do occur naturally. What may have changed, and you'd have to do a lot of analysis to demonstrate this, is events of this magnitude may have occurred in the past when the catchments were less developed.
Yeah, there are a lot of factors besides rainfall that affect flooding. There's land clearing, there's developments, there's dams and levees. And you heard right, there's no evidence these floods are climate change in action. Still, the ABC journalist's climate obsession wasn't done with yet.
So it's possible that these are not abnormal events, but they've been superimposed onto a landscape that's been heavily developed in the last 30 years or so.
Yeah, I do want to get on to the development issues, but just sticking with climate change, I mean, we were told that we would see extreme weather events more often and that they would be more severe. I mean, doesn't this fit into that category?
Yes, it does fit into that category, but cause and effect are not easy to tease out in this particular context. It is true that under climate change, we are likely to see more extreme events. That doesn't mean that every extreme event that we see is caused by climate change. The risk of more extreme events is increasing due to climate change, but whether these particular events that we've seen are caused by climate change is difficult to ascertain. And in fact, there are fairly well-established physical mechanisms that have explained the events that have occurred over the East Coast in the last year. And climate change doesn't always have to be included in those explanations. That said, the ocean temperatures are very warm, and that does tend to lead to more energy in the storm events, and that can lead to more intense rainfall. But equally, it may just be natural processes that are conspiring against us in this particular circumstance.
There you have it from the expert. And yes, cause and effect. That's the problem in a nutshell, because climate science says what we now call extreme climate events are likely to happen more often. Media and politicians try to fit every storm, every fire, drought or flood into the climate change cause to fit their narrative. And it's very damaging. It's why we have more than $10 billion worth of white elephant desalination plants and no new dams. It's why politicians find it easier to increase your power bills than to raise the height of the Warragamba Dam. It's why we are not doing practical things to make our communities resilient, and instead we are pretending we can make natural disasters a thing of the past, even though we live in the land of droughts and flooding rains.